Begin the Gemara today on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, a few lines from the bottom of the Amud. 3 lines from the bottom. So here in the Gemara, this is a continuation of the halacha that was mentioned in the Mishnah, that a get that's written on a material that's connected to the ground, and then you cut it, and then you give it, it's pasul. Because the Torah says, v'kosav v'nosan. You have to write and give, not if there has to be a step of cutting it in between. So Zak the Gemara, Kasvai al cheres shel otzitz nokev. If you wrote a get on an earthenware flower pot, so you write it on the actual flower pot itself. And then he gives it to the Isha, kosher. It's going to be kosher. Now, when is this kosher? The shokale v'yavla ne'ala. You took the whole flower pot and you gave it to her. So Rashi says that we're not concerned that he may break off that piece that he wrote the get on from this flower pot, and he may give it to the Isha. Because if he breaks it off and then gives it to the Isha, then there's a problem that he's writing, cutting it off, and giving it to the Isha. So over here, he writes it on it, and he gives the whole flower pot to her with this writing on it, and it's kosher. Al-Olesh shel otzitz nokov. But if he writes the get on a leaf of of a plant that's growing in this flower pot, which has a hole in it, so then Abaye Omar kosher. Abaye says this is still kosher, and Rava Omar pasul. And Rava says no, in such a case it will be pasul. Abaye Omar kosher. So the Gemara explains the machlokes. Abaye says it's kosher, and the case over here is the shokale v'yavle ne'ala. It's because he's giving her the entire flower pot. He's giving her the whole thing. So he's not writing it on the leaf and then cutting off the leaf and giving it to her. He's giving her the whole entire thing. And the Rishonim actually explain, you may ask, but when he gives her the whole entire flower pot, it has holes. If it has holes, so then seemingly the very fact that it has holes means that it's sort of connected to the ground that it sits on. And then when you give her the whole entire flower pot, you're like cutting it off from the ground. So the Ran says that's not an issue of cutting, because you pick it up and give it to her. If you cut it, and when you cut it, you're not giving, and then you do a separate act of giving, then it's a problem. But here, you take this flower pot which is sitting on the ground, and you pick it all up and give it straight to her. So it's not two separate acts. So therefore it's not a problem. Rava Amar pasul. But Rava says that there is a psul midrabanan in such a case, even though you're giving her the entire flower pot with the leaf and everything, you're not cutting anything first. Because when you wrote it on one leaf, there's a gzeira that you may cut off that leaf and give her just the leaf and not the rest of the flower pot. Regarding the flower pot itself, if you write it on the flower pot itself, we're not afraid a person might break off a piece of the flower pot and give it to her. Why would he damage his flower pot? But regarding a leaf, he might cut off one leaf and give it to her. Adarabi, the man wants to keep the plant for himself, and he's just going to cut off one leaf that he wrote the get on and give it to her. So that's why we're concerned of Shema Yiktim. There's a big discussion in Rishonim about this piece of Gemara here. One of the details that Tosfos, this long Tosfos over here on Daf Chaf Aleph discusses, is that the Gemara here is specifically saying that we're talking about otzitz nokov, a flower pot with a hole in it. So Tosfos says, according to one opinion, that mikan raya, that this whole issue of cutting off the get from something that's mechuber is only if it's mechuber to the ground. But if you have an item that you write a get on part of it, and then you cut it in half, and so you sort of separate it, you cut off one half from the other half, but the other half is not connected to the ground. For example, a parchment or whatever material it may be, there's no issue of cutting off. Because if there would be an issue, so then why is the Gemara saying otzitz nokov? It could have just spoke about the otzitz without being nokov. The fact that you cut off the leaf from the rest of the plant should also be an issue. Elamai, the issue is only because it's nokov, and therefore it gets a connection from the ground. That's what Tosfos here says. But there's a big further discussion about this. That's just one akoda. Okay, now because the Gemara brought up this otzitz nokov, so it brings other halachas that doesn't relate directly to a get, but regarding a kinyan, to acquire, to buy from someone this otzitz nokov. So before I read the Gemara inside, the halachas regarding a kinyan is, there's a difference between a kinyan for karkois or a kinyan for metaltalin. The way you acquire a piece of karka is kesef, shtar, or chazaka, either money or a document or a chazaka. Chazaka is usually by a piece of land, you do some work in the land itself, whether you put up a fence or you dig in it, you improve it in some way, you do some kind of work in the land itself. That's chazaka. That's the kinyan of karka. The kinyan for metaltalin, chazaka does not work for metaltalin. Or kesef midrabanan also doesn't work for metaltalin. What's the kinyan for metaltalin? Usually meshicha. when you take the item, you pull the item towards into your domain. That's the kinyan of metalton, of movable items. So now when you have an otzitz nokov, the Gemara here will explain what is an otzitz nokov. Does it have the halacha of a karka, or does it have a halacha of metalton? The answer is the otzitz, the actual flower pot itself, is a movable item. It's just it's a flower pot. But the actual growth, the plant that's growing in it, which is, if it has holes and it takes nourishment from the ground, that's a piece of karka. So the kinyan for the two parts of this otzitz nokov is not going to be the same. So if you have a otzitz shel echad, this flower pot, the actual flower pot itself belongs to one person. Uzrayim shel acher, and what's planted inside of it belongs to someone else. So machar bal otzitz lebal zroyim. So if the person that owns the flower pot is selling his flower pot to the person that owns the plant inside of it, kivin shemashach kona. As soon as he does meshicha, he takes it and pulls it towards him into his domain. So that's the kinyan for the flower pot, because as I mentioned, it's an item that's movable, metaltlin, and you kain it with meshicha. Machar bal zroyim lebal otzitz. Other way around, the person that owns the plant, so he wants to sell his plant to the one that owns the actual flower pot itself. So over here, there's no kinyan. You can't pull it, you can't do meshicha to bring it into your domain, but you have to do chazaka. He's going to have to do something to improve the plant itself. That is a kinyan for the zrayim, which has the halacha like a karka. And for that, you need a kinyan of chazaka. Right? So Rashi here points out that there is really another option. When you buy karka, you can just give kesef. Kesef is a kinyan. But over here, if there's no money involved, if it's a gift or he has no money, so over here the kinyan will be chazaka. Now, otzitz uzrayim shel echad. If the flower pot and the plant inside of it belongs to one person, umachran la'acher, and he's selling both of these to somebody, so hichzik bizrayim. So here the Gemara will introduce another halacha, which is in the Gemara in Kiddushin, which is known as kinyan agav. Kinyan agav means that if I buy a piece of land, so then together with this piece of land, I could be kinda other movable items that are in this property. There's actually a discussion there in the Gemara whether those items have to be in the property or even not in the property, but let's say it's inside the property. So you're buying from someone a piece of land, and in the property he has other tools and things. So together with the kinyan that you make on the property itself, you're kind of other movable items. You don't have to make a separate kinyan for the movable items. You kind of automatically. But the other way around, if you make a kinyan on movable items, you're not going to be kind of the property that they are sitting on. So over here, regarding this flower pot and the plant in it, so hichzik bizrayim, if you make a chazaka in the plants that's growing, so that's a kinyan of karka. So then kana otzitz, so automatically that kinyan will be effective to acquire the pot itself. This is the halach in the Gemara in Kiddushim, that nechasim she'en lam achrayis, items or possessions that have no responsibility for them. What does this mean? This is movable items. Movable items are things that can disappear, you can hide them. If you owe money to someone, they're not here guaranteed that he could collect from them, because you can move them away. So niknin, these movable items will be acquired automatically im nechasim sheyesh lam achrayis, with a piece of land which is referred to as something which you can take responsibility for it, because a piece of land is not going anywhere. If you owe anyone money, they'll collect from this piece of land because it's staying there. So the point is, if you make the kinyan for the karka, which is bekesef or b'shtar or b'chazakeh, whatever kinyan, proper kinyan you made for the karka itself, so agav, the karka, the metaltalin gets acquired along with it. So here as well, you made a kinyan on the plant, the flower pot is acquired along with it. On the other hand though, hichzik ba'otzitz, if he makes a chazakeh in the flower pot itself, so there's two problems here. So then you're not kind of anything. Af otzitz lekana. Not only are you not kind of the plant inside, but you're not kind of the flower pot either. If you did something to improve the flower pot itself, that's not a kinyan for the flower pot, because it's metaltlin, it's movable. You have to do meshicha for that. So he's not going to be kaina yachzik bizrayim unless you make the chazakeh in the plant, and then through the plant you can be kaina the pot itself. Okay, another halacha here related to a flower pot. Again, this is a completely different halacha now. This will relate to the obligation of trumas and maasros. When a person has a flower pot that's growing right at the border of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, and the question is, what grows now in this flower pot? Will it be chayiv and trumas and maasros if the branches of what's growing in this flower pot is hanging over into Chutz La'aretz? So nikvai But when we have it here, 1 second. Nikvai ba'aretz. So what happens if you have this flower pot and it has holes, so therefore it gets nourishment from the ground that it sits on, and it's an Eretz Yisrael. But v'noifei b'chutz la'aretz, the branches of this plant, of the flower pot, hangs over into chutz la'aretz. So that's the question over here is it chayiv in Trumas and Maasros or not? Abaye says, Basa nikvei as lina. We follow where the holes are, and since the holes are in the ground of Eretz Yisrael, it's chayiv. Rava says, no, we follow the branches, and since the branches are hanging over into chutz la'aretz, it's potter. So the Gemara explains, Bide ashrosh, if you clearly see that there are roots that are coming out of the holes of this flower pot, going into the ground of Eretz Yisrael, kula al malei pligi. In such a case, there's no argument that since it gets its roots and its nourishment from the ground, the fact that the branches hang over into chutz la'aretz is meaningless, and it's going to be chayiv. In Trumas and Maasros. Keep ligi, when is the argument? But the lo yashish, when there are no roots that you see coming out of the flower pot into the land. So now the question is, it's still sitting on the ground. It gets some moisture. It does get some machluchas from the ground on one hand, but on the other hand, the airspace that the actual branches are in chutz la'aretz, you could also say that the branches need to have oxygen that it grows from in the air. If it has no oxygen, it's not going to survive. So where is it? It's in the airspace of chutz la'aretz. So in such a case, that's when they argue if it has the halacha of Eretz Yisrael or chutz la'aretz. So the Gemara asks on this: Ubida ashish, are you telling me that when there clearly are roots in Eretz Yisrael, loy pligi? There's no argument about this. In other words, there's nobody that says that even though on one hand there are roots in Eretz Yisrael, on the other hand, the branches being in chutz la'aretz, that alone, that it's in the airspace of chutz la'aretz, that's not significant enough that it should have the halacha like chutz la'aretz. So the Gemara over here brings a halacha where there's a discussion regarding the ownership of a piece of land. And when is that? So v'hatnan, there's a mission at the end of Bab Metzia. Shtei ginoi zu gavzu. If you have two gardens that are right near each other, but one is lower down, and one is right next to it on a piece of land that's higher up. And the yerek ben tayim, there's sort of a wall between the lower garden and the higher garden, like a wall which is almost like a straight up wall, but like a very, very steep wall that goes up to the higher garden. And there, on that wall between the lower garden and the higher garden, there are vegetables that are growing there in that wall. So who do these vegetables belong to? Rav Meir Shel Elyon. Rav Meir says it belongs to the owner of the top garden. Rav Yehuda says the vegetables growing in this wall between the top and the bottom garden, it belongs to the person that owns the bottom garden. So what do you see over here? What's the simple explanation of this machlokes? The machlokes over here is, Rav Meir says that you have to look where the roots of the vegetables are growing from. They're growing from the ground that belongs to the top garden. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, look at where it's protruding into. It's in the airspace of the tachtin. The vegetables grow out into the airspace of the tachtin, so you go after the branches or sort of the airspace where it grows into. So here you see clearly, even though it's the roots, it does have the roots in the elyon, but nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda says that you follow the airspace of where it's at. So we should say the same thing regarding what's growing on the flower pot at the border of Eretz Yisrael, that even if it has roots in Eretz Yisrael, but it has branches into chutz la'aretz, we should say that even then there's the machlokes, and maybe you can go after the branches. So the Gemara says there's no question from there, there's no raya from there. Why? Because hasam kidiktani taime. Over there's a completely different reason why you would follow the branches, even though it has roots in the ground, in the earth of the elyon. Because Rab Meir explained his opinion and said, you know why I say it belongs to the elyon, to the garden on the top, because ma im yirtze elyon litel asafare. What's if the person that owns the garden on the top decides to dig and remove all of his earth from here? So ain't kanyerek. There's no vegetables. He's the one that's allowing his earth to be there to enable these vegetables to grow. So therefore it's his. But on that, on Rabbi Yehuda responds to that. But ma im yirtza hatachtain lemales as ginosei ofar. What if the tachtain decides that he's going to bring a dump truck and fill up the entire place with sand or earth, and there won't be any space, there won't be any ear space for the vegetables to grow here. So ain't kanyerek. There's no vegetables here either. So over here, in other words, the point over here that you're going after, that you're saying that there's a svara, that the tachton owns it, it's not just the very fact that it's protruding into your ear space, so it's getting nourishment from your ear space and therefore belongs to you. No, it's the fact that he has the ability to prevent these vegetables of growing here, so therefore he says, I have the rights to these vegetables. But regarding Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, when something is just hanging over into Chutz La'aretz, if it has roots in Eretz Yisrael, just the very fact that it's hanging over into Chutz La'aretz is not enough of a reason to say that the branches get nourishment from the airspace of Chutz La'aretz, that it should be potter of Terumas HaMaisos. The Gemara has another question. Vakati, still I have a question for you. B'da ashrosh loy pligi. Is it true that even if there are roots in Eretz Yisrael, that there's no argument when the branches are hanging over into Chutz La'aretz? But Vatanya, we learned in the Braisa that says, Elon, miktsase baretz and miktsase b'chutz la'aretz. If you have a tree, that part of it is in Eretz Yisrael, and part of it is in Chutz La'aretz. So what's the halacha with this tree? Tevel v'chulim v'uravin zeh b'zeh divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says, so because part is in Eretz Yisrael, part is in Chutz La'aretz, so it has a mixture of tevel and chulin. Part of it is chayiv and meiser, so until you give meiser, it's tevel, and part of it is from chutz la'aretz, so it's chulin. So it's mixed with one another. If it's mixed with one another, so then you're going to have to give meisers of it, and it's sort of a suffix. You won't be able to give meisers from any other tree on this tree, because this is just a suffix, and you can't give meisers from this tree and anything else. You're going to have to give meisers for itself, separately, because it's a suffix. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel argues, Hagadol b'chi of chayiv, that the part of the tree that grows in the place where it's obligated, in Eretz Yisrael, will be obligated in Maasros, v'agadol b'ptur, pater. And the part of the tree that grows in a place in Chutz La'aretz where it's pater will be pater. So there's no mixture here in this tree. You just have to look at each part of the tree where it's growing. Now what exactly here is the case with this tree? That part of it is in Eretz Yisrael, and part of it is in Chutz La'aretz. So the Gemara now says, my love, don't you think the case over here is that the mixture in this tree is with the branches? Miktsas noifei baretz, part of the branches are in Eretz Yisrael, or miktsas noifei b'chutz la'aretz, and part of the branches are in chutz la'aretz. Meaning what the Gemara is saying right now is, in the Havamina, that where the roots are, it doesn't matter. It could be the roots are fully in chutz la'aretz, it could be the roots are fully in Eretz Yisrael, but nevertheless, when it comes to where the branches are, that matters. The branches get some nourishment of the ear space where it's in, and therefore if there's a mixture, if part of the branches are in Eretz Yisrael and part are in Chutz La'aretz, here's the machlokes. Rebbe says that it's considered to be all a mixture, and the Rabbanon Rav Shimon ben Gamliel say that no, those branches that are in Chutz La'aretz are Chutz La'aretz, and those branches that are in Eretz Yisrael are Eretz Yisrael. Isn't that the way to explain this machlokes? So again, we see over here that even it could be it has roots fully in Eretz Yisrael, but nevertheless, if there's some branches that go into Chutz La'aretz, it gets affected by that. And there's a machlokes over here, whether it's a mixture or whether I say it's fully Chutz La'aretz. So how could you say that if it has roots in Eretz Yisrael, that where the branches are don't matter? Answers the Gemara, loy. That's not the pshat of the machlokes. That's not what the case is about. Rather, the case is miktsas sharoshim ba'aretz. Part of the roots of this tree, the tree itself, the roots of the tree are on the border. Part of it is in Eretz Yisrael, and part of the roots are outside Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that's where the Chachamim's opinion, Rebbe's opinion is very understood. Because when you have roots of the tree, and part of the roots are taking its roots, are taking its nourishment from Chutz La'aretz, and part are taking its nourishment from Eretz Yisrael, so the chayis that comes from the ground goes into the entire tree. So it's all mixed. I can't say this fruit comes from Eretz Yisrael and this fruit comes from Chutz La'aretz. The roots itself are part in Eretz Yisrael, part not. So it's all mixed. That's what Rebbe says. So the Gemara asks in this, if that's the case, on my time with Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. So how could Rav Shimon ben Gamliel say, look at the half of the tree which is in Eretz Yisrael and half of the tree which is not in Eretz Yisrael? It doesn't make sense. Even if you have half of the branches which are in Eretz Yisrael, but it's also getting nourishment from those roots which are in Chutz La'aretz, and the same thing vice versa. So how do you split this tree into half? And says the Gemara, the case over here is the mafsik tzunmeh, that this is a tree that the roots are sort of divided into two. There is this big rock that cuts this tree, that cuts the roots of the tree into half. Right over there on the border between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, there's a rock that separates the roots of Chutz La'aretz to the roots of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says you have to divide the part of the tree that gets its nourishment from these roots and the part of the tree that gets nourishment from the other roots. It's sort of almost like two trees. that because it has this rock that's separating the roots right in the middle of it. Says the Gemara, say, if so, my time with the Rebbe. So why does Rebbe say that it's all like one tree and the chayas of the roots from Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz get mixed into the entire tree together? And says the Gemara, because true, it has that big rock that separates the roots, but the Hadri Arvi, the Hadri Arvi, afterwards, when the tree comes up, in the trunk of the tree over there, it does mix back to become one tree. In the ground, it's sort of growing like two trees, like roots, like two separate trees, but then it does mix back up. So what's the argument here? What's the basis of the argument of Rebbe and Rav Shimon Gamliel? Marsava, Rebbe holds Avira Mevalvel. That part of the tree that's exposed, that's in the air, over there, because it becomes back one tree, so over there, the chayas of the tree that it gets from the ground, it gets mixed back up into one, and therefore all the fruits of the tree from any side of it all gets chayas from both Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. But Amar Sava, Rav Shimon Gamliel says that because by the roots they're mamish totally disconnected from each other. The two parts of the tree are still separated, and even after it comes up and it becomes one tree, but it sort of remains, and the chayas goes two separate places, and it does not mix with each other. Should I say? That's what he says. That's the nature of things. It's once the roots grow completely separately, it doesn't mix back up later when it comes, or at least it doesn't mix enough. They're probably not arguing the Metzias Mamish. It's hard to say that they're arguing about a fact, but it doesn't mix enough. It probably mixes to some extent, but not as much as other trees. So therefore, I can say that the fruits on the right side are more connected to the nourishment that comes from the roots on the right side, and the same thing with the left. So therefore, it's enough to separate it from each other.
So okay, you do give and part of you do.
Correct. That's Rav Shimon Gamliel, right? Rav Yehuda ben Beseiraim, going back to what we learned in the Mishnah brought up a get that was written on parchment that wasn't properly prepared. It's not properly smooth to write on it a get. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says you can't write a get on that because it's easy to forge, it's easy to erase and forge the writing of this get. So Gemara brings up different kinds of parchments that are not fully worked out and fully smooth. There are three different hides of animals that are not proper parchments. One is called matzah, the other one is called chayfa, and v'diftere. The third is diftere. What are these three parchments? So when you make the parchment to become a smooth parchment, there are three stages to it, as we'll see here in the Gemara. So each one of these were only worked out partially, but not worked out. Or actually the matzah, the Gemara says matzah kemashmoi. Matzah means literally like matzah. What does it mean kemashmoi? What's matzah? Matzah is you take flour and water, you mix it together, and you put it immediately into the oven. You don't allow it to rise properly. You don't prepare anything else with the dough. You just put it straight into the oven. So the same thing over here. It means that you took the hide of the animal, the loy maliach, and it was not yet salted, which is the first step of smoothing it out. And then the loy kamiach, flour, is also used to smooth it out. And the loy offits, and then there's gallnuts that's also used to smooth it out. So none of these steps that smooth it out were done. So it's a very rough parchment. That's what matzah is. Now, lamai hilchaseh. Now, the fact that we divide these into three different categories, there's a certain relevance in halacha, and this is regarding being mitzi, carrying on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, when you carry, there has to be a minimum shear for the use of what it could be used for. Just learned this in Rambam and Hilchos Shabbos. So this parchment, which is completely rough, regarding what is the shear of it for carrying on Shabbos, like Tzah Shabbos. Regarding Shabbos, it has its own halacha of its shear. Kamashi Yurai, how much is the shear of this kind of rough parchment that's called matzah? Kedektanit of Shmuel by Yehuda, that what is it used for? Kedei lotzer mishkal ketana, in order to use it to cover a small weight. That's what it used for. You can't write on it, and you can't use it for anything other than just as a cover. So yeah, a small weight that could be covered, that's the minimum amount to be carried on Shabbos to be chayiv. Now, v'kama, what is this small weight that we're talking about? Amar Abaye, ki riva, the pumpedisa. A quarter of a quarter, very small weight. It's usually was made out of lead, these weights. And to cover that is the shear to be chayiv to carry on Shabbos. Now, the next kind of parchment, it's not really a parchment, it's sort of a hide of an animal that's not worked out properly to be a parchment. It's called chayfa. What is this chayfa? The maliach, it already was salted, but v'loy kamiach. There's no flour that was put in it, and v'loy offits, and the gallnuts also. So it's only the first step of working it out was done. Lamai hilchasa. Now, what's the shear for this? How is this relevant in halacha leitzah Shabbos for carrying it on Shabbos? What would be the minimum amount to be chayiv? Leitzah Shabbos. The Gemara says the halacha it's relevant for Shabbos. Now, v'kama sheyuroi. What is the shear of carrying? Keditnan, as the Mishnah says, or kedei lastis kameya. When you make an amulet and you want to cover this amulet with a hide of an animal, so there's a minimum amount to cover this amulet. That's what this chayfa is used for. Diftara, the third category of the hide of an animal that's not worked out properly, is the meliach v'kamiach. It already 2 steps were done. It was salted and it was also the flour was placed in it, but v'loy offits, but the gallnuts, it wasn't smoothed out completely. So what's the relevance of the halacha of this kind of hide? Leitzah Shabbos, also for carrying on Shabbos, and v'kama sheyurei, what's the minimum amount to be chayiv if you carry this? So this is already something that's used to write on it, but you can't write on it a sefer Torah, you can't write on it a mezuzah because it's not a proper parchment. But what could you write on it? Kidei lichtev alav es a get. This is in order to be able to write on it a get. This is according to the opinion of the Chachamim in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda ben Besein in the Mishnah said you can't write a get on it. But the Chachamim in the Mishnah say that you can write a get on it. That's the minimum amount to be chayiv on Shabbos. Now Rashi adds, the Gemara doesn't bring the 4th category because it's not part of these hides that are not worked out, but the 4th category is a proper parchment. A proper parchment, so what's the shear to be chayiv for that on Shabbos? The smallest parsha to write in it, like to write in it the first parsha of the mezuzah, parsha of Shema. So if you carry that on Shabbos, that's the amount to be chayiv. Now the Mishnah said, the Chachamim machshirin. The Chachamim say to write a get even on this parchment that's not worked out properly, and it's possible to forge this get, so still it can be used for a get. So the question is, why would it be kosher? So here, before I read the Gemara inside, what's the concern here about this get? The concern here about this get is that a woman receiving this get may falsify something here. Let's say she gets a get from her husband and she discovers that inside the get, it says some very difficult condition for her to keep. So she'll erase the condition. Or it doesn't have proper signatures. So she'll forge signatures, or she'll erase. So the concern over here is that the woman may change something after she received this get. But Chachamim say, even though this is a document that's very easy to play around with and erase it, it's not smooth, still it's kosher. So why do they say it's kosher? Says the Gemara, man Chachamim.
What's the purpose? Not to get divorced.
Again? She wants to be divorced. She doesn't want to have any problems, so she forges. Again? No. Adarab. She takes off a tanai. She erases a condition, so she'll be divorced unconditionally, or any other thing that she wants to erase.
Doing it, figuring sizes on Shabbos.
Again. This because regarding Shabbos, okay, that's regarding the minimum size that's useful. That's what you're chayav for. If it's not useful for anything, you're not chayav for carrying it. So it has to be a minimum size that it's useful for something. Okay, man chachamim. So who's the opinion of the chachamim of our Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar says, and this is actually a Rabbi Lazar, which is an Amayre, which is, I believe, Rabbi Lazar ben Pedas. Rabbi Lazar, the Tana of our Mishnah is Rabbi Lazar, which was Rabbi Lazar ben Shamua. What does Rabbi Lazar say? We had this already many times here in the Masechta. Eidei mesire karti. Rabbi Lazar says, in order to be machsher a get, you don't need eidim that sign a get. You just need eidim that are there when you give the get to the isha. So Rashi here brings, Rabbi Lazar's shitta is, you have to have eidim when you give the get to the isha, because this is a davisha be'erva. You're taking a woman that's an eishes ish, and you want her to be not an Eishes Ish anymore. So the rule is for every Davish Be'erva, you have to have 2 Eidim for this. So Rabbi Lazar says, since you must have the 2 Eidim there for the Davish Be'erva of the Mesira of the get, so those 2 Eidim are also the ones that are Machshir the get. And you don't need any other Eidim that sign on the get. So therefore, according to Rabbi Lazar, we learned already before in the Gemara, the Eidim that are there when you give the get, they must read the get. They have to see everything that's written inside the get. So they see what's written in the get, and if the Isha then later wants to come and falsify something, erase something, the Eidim Mesira will remember. They'll know, they know what's written in the get. If she's going to come later to the Bezdin and want to use this get to prove that she was divorced and she can get married to someone else, so the Eid Mesire will be the ones that will tell us that they saw what's written in the get and they know that it's good. So therefore, there's no issue of this get, even if it could be erased, it doesn't matter. That's according to Rabbi Lazar. Okay, but here, the Rashi, though, explains, when it comes to Rab Meir, though, Rab Meir says that you have the Eidim that signed the get, Now, those Eidim that sign the get, what happens if a woman's going to want to come and get married later? She's going to bring the get to Bezdin with the signatures on the get, and she doesn't even necessarily have to bring those Eidim that signed it. Bezdin will allow her to get married just with the get, as is, because they see the signatures on the get. And even if there'll be a suffix, if those signatures are accurate or not, so there's many ways of verifying signatures. You don't even need those Eidim that sign it to necessarily come. If anyone else recognizes those signatures, it's good enough. So therefore, Bezdin will allow her to get married just with these signatures. Now, that means it is a possibility for her to erase a line in the get, and we'll never know. We'll never know whether she erased this line in the get or not. So therefore, according to Rab Meir, it is a problem, the fact that she's relying on these signatures without those Eidim actually coming. That's how Rashi learns this. Okay, now from just to point out one thing here, from Rashi, it's mashma that even according to Rab Meir, what's if those Eidim that signed the get actually would come, then it wouldn't be a problem. Because the Eidim that signed it read what it says in the get, and now they are here, so even Rab Meir would agree that it's not a problem. The problem we have is that those Eidim may not even be here, because the Bezdin, that is, may just rely on the signatures itself. Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos has the shitta in the whole sugya regarding Rab Meir's opinion here and in other places, that according to Rab Meir, a get has to be muchach mitoichai. The get itself has to be written in such a way that it's impossible to forge it, impossible to falsify it. The very fact that you could theoretically forge it is already a problem according to Rab Meir. That's because Rab Meir says the signatures are in the get itself. The get itself has to be 100% proper. Rabbi Elazar says you have outside Eidim that read it, and we rely on those Eidim, even if it's possible to play around with the get itself, but we rely on those outside Eidim. So that's the Chachamim in our Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar. Okay, but now the Gemara continues and gives a limitation to this shit of Rabbi Elazar. Says the Gemara, V'amar Rabbi Elazar. That's again Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas. Lo hichsher Rabbi Elazar, the Tana, wasn't machsher in this case when the document itself could be forged, and he's relying on the Eidim that read it and know and will tell us about it. Elal alter. That's only if she brings this get to the Bezdin soon after she received it. So then we say that we rely on the Eidim Mesira, that they remember what they read in the get. What's if she shows up with this get 10 days later? Then we can't rely on the Eidei Mesida that read the get to know what was written in it. Because Chashinan Dilma Have Beituna, maybe there was another condition that was written there on this get, and Viziyafte, and she erased that Tanai, because this is a document that's easy to erase, and because it's 10 days later, the Eidei Mesida forgot about it. Yeah, they did read the get, but they remember forever exactly what's written in any particular get. They may have forgotten about it if it's 10 days later. So therefore, you can only rely on this if it's brought immediately. Rabbi Yechanan is not concerned for this. He says, even if it's brought 10 days later, it doesn't matter. We rely on the Eidei Mesida. The Misa Dave Beituna, because if this get had a condition, Mitka Docher, the Eidim that is, would remember what's written inside the get. Other Eidim, they remember. A Tanai is not such a usual thing to be written in a get. It's an extra line. The Eidim would remember this. Another thing Rabbi Elazar said about the opinion of Rabbi Elazar the Tana. When is he machsher a get that could be falsified? If it's with the Eidei Mesira, we rely on them reading what's written in this document. By Hechsher, Rabbi Elazar ela begittin. Rabbi Elazar was only machsher when it comes to a get. Aval b'shar shtaris, when it comes to any other money documents, loy. You can't rely on the Eidei Mesira that will remember what they read inside this document. Because the Chsev, what does it say regarding a money document? V'nesatem b'kli cheres. Pasuk describes, why do you write a document? To prove ownership over anything, so that you can take this document and place it in an earthenware vessel, so you can have this document for many years later to prove ownership. So the whole point of a star by a mamain is that it should be fit to be used many years later. So Rabbi Elazar would agree that a document that cannot be used many years later, because you're relying on the Eidei Mesira, and the Eidei Mesira, they may have read it now, but many years later they're not going to remember what they read. So that's not a good document. Even today, it's not a good document. Not only later, a document has to l'chatchila be something that's fit to be used for many years later. If not, it's not valid at all. But Rabbi Yechanan,
what was the gift to it? I forgot.
One second. Rabbi Yechanan says, Afile b'shtarais. No, that Rabbi Elazar's opinion that a document will be kosher even with Eidei Mesira, without any signatures on the get. That's even by any money document. Fragt the Gemara, but doesn't the pasuk say that a money document has to be something that's fit to be used many years later? Says the Gemara, no, not necessarily. Hasam eitze teive kamash malon. The pasuk is telling you, it's giving you good advice that you want to have a document available and to be proof for many years later. So you put signatures in it, and then you'll have the document for many years later. But even if it won't be a raya for many years later, even if you'll have Eidei Mesira, as long as the Eidei Mesira will remember, it's a good document. If the Eidei Mesira won't remember, then you have a problem. So then you'll need Eidei Chesima. But as long as you have Eidei Mesira that will remember, the document is good, according to Rabbi Elazar, not only by a get, but even by a regular star.